All right, welcome back everyone to another episode of SCROTUS, and we are joined again with the incomparable Colin.
Hello.
And today we're I want to jump straight into this new case that we're going to talk about. It's Brown versus United States.
I'm always against the United States.
Yes,
Always.
I was going to pre-warn you of that, but I figured
I
best
should
to get
say
your
I'm always
natural
against the
reaction.
United States government. I love the United States, but when I hear versus United States, yeah, that's not the people. That's something else.
You're
Sorry.
very correct. You're very
Yeah.
correct. I want to sort of preempt this by also saying that this was collapsed with another case that was very similar, Jackson versus United States. Very similar facts in both of these cases. I'm not going to talk about the Jackson case, primarily because the actual Supreme Court oral argument only focused on the Brown case and Brown's argument against the United States. So just for lack of knowledge and lack of actual record of the Jackson case, I'm not going to bring it up. But for those of you who are interested and listening, this was collapsed with a similar case.
Can I ask as a total idiot on this front, how normal is that to collapse cases like that?
I'm under the impression that it is fairly normal because, as we talked about on a previous episode, the Supreme Court doesn't hear cases, they hear questions, right? So
Okay.
they're concerned about answering a question. So if there are two cases that are centered around the same question about some doctrine or statute, if they can hear kind of the sides of both parties of different two different cases and collapse them into one, all the better. But
That
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah, because it's interpretational type of rulings. Like they're like, how do we interpret the Constitution on this, and this? Yeah,
yes,
as
yeah,
opposed
yeah,
to it, as opposed to a dog bit me, and I'm angry.
right. So those the facts and everything are adjudicated in lower courts.
Okay,
Once it gets to the Supreme Court, we're concerned with questions and issues, I guess, rather than facts of a specific case.
okay, thank you. No, as we were saying before we recorded, as somebody who's really a medieval scholar, I'm more worried about trial by combat. And you're like, whoa, 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 this is like Supreme Court. I'm like, oh, there's no swords involved, and you're like, not usually. So
No, no,
yeah,
unfortunately not.
he said it, not me.
Maybe swords of words or and ideas, but
Yeah.
not legitimate swords. Okay, so in this case, we're centered around the question of sentencing, specifically sentencing in cases of serious quote serious drug offenses. And so this also centers around the Armed Career Criminal Act, which was passed in 1984. And so I don't have to say that over and over and over again. I'm going to abbreviate that to the ACCA, Armed Career Criminal Act. I'll reference it several times. So the question is, should courts base sentences on law at the time of the offense or at law at the time of sentencing,
Ooh, that's a good
right?
question.
So as laws change, specifically about drugs, as we will get into, um, when we're sentencing criminals, when should we how should we weigh those laws against their sentence? This case also brings up issues of state versus federal law. So that's going to be another point of contention that we might get into. So some of the facts here. Justin Rashad Brown pled guilty in 2019 to possessing a firearm as a previously convicted felon. So he was a previously convicted felon for drug-related crimes, and in 2019 he pled guilty for possessing a firearm, which was a felon is not allowed to do.
Yeah.
He was
Unless you
also he
get your
also
rights
pled
reinstated, which is very difficult, but you can in some
yes
cases, I would say, so I know it's a separate topic, but in some cases, I think there are fully rehabilitated people. I know of at least one
yeah
who I think it's pretty legit that you do that. But yeah,
Yeah,
statistically
it can
speaking,
happen.
a lot of times there's reasons why, yeah, you don't get to possess a firearm if, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And he also pled guilty in 2019 to possessing and distributing cocaine. So
It's
Brown
a hell
had,
of a drug.
yes, as Miss Houston said, Brown had five prior drug offenses. So the felonies that I alluded to previously. So four of them were related to marijuana, and this was
Hmm.
back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So in 2021, a district court in Pennsylvania ruled that his previous offenses qualified as, quote, serious drug offenses and sentenced him to over 30 years imprisonment.
Holy shit.
So that I'll get into why such a serious sentencing. But first, to sort of define, so the legal definition of serious drug offense is so it's defined as an offense under the Federal Controlled Substances Act or an offense violating some state law regarding a controlled substance. So, in other words, the federal law, which is the Controlled Substances Act, which changes, as we know, as different drugs come on the market or come into being, um, or different drugs are considered, okay, maybe this is no longer should be criminalized.
Yeah.
Marijuana, for example, in many states. But federally, we have a controlled substances list or act. And so there are things on that list that obviously would cause an offense. So any offense under that act or any offense on a state law regarding some of these controlled substances. So if you violate either of these multiple times, these are racking up serious drug offenses, right? So the reason that Brown's sentence was so hefty was the ACCA, the Armed Career Criminal Act of 1984, imposes a minimum sentence of 15 years for felons possessing firearms who have also had at least three prior either violent felony convictions or serious drug offenses. So this is exactly why Mr. Brown had the hard hand of the law slapped upon him, right? Um,
Can I
he
ask a quick question?
yes.
Do, and you're probably going to get to this, so sorry. This is your brain on ADD, kids. Um, so serious drug offenses, was he like using, he had a weapon that he was not allowed to have, and was he using it in order to like sell or drugs or take over territory for distribution or something like, or we don't know. I'm just
That was
curious if
not
you know.
that was not detailed
Okay.
in the facts of the case. So
Okay.
a good question,
I mean, I know it might not have, it probably doesn't have bearing on this particular thing, but it's just to give context. Like, I'm just curious.
I'm sure I'm sure if that had been the case, it would have been detailed in the fact sheet, or
I think
in the various places that I've looked for
probably
facts about
also,
this case.
it's probably safe to say if you're involved in the drug trade and you're armed, there's a reason why you're armed, and that's because you're in the drug trade and it's a violent line of work, I guess. Uh,
Yes.
I'm thinking a bit here of if there's any fellow Wire fans. I'm thinking a bit of Omar in the Wire. How does one get to be a stick-up boy for 8 consecutive years? Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. So basically, yeah. So this act imposes, as I said, a minimum 15-year sentence for felons possessing firearms who had three serious drug offense convictions. So by definition, Brown fit the bill. And I mean, to basically double the minimum sentencing is still quite a bit, but
That's a lot. Yeah.
the court deemed it necessary, apparently. But as you can tell, Mr. Brown appealed that sentencing, but he appealed it for a very specific reason. So Brown claimed that he did not actually fit the requirements of the ACCA. He claimed that his past marijuana charges should not be considered um, as points against him or strikes against him under this law because while he was convicted of these marijuana charges in the early 2000s, Pennsylvania law and federal law no longer match since federal law decriminalized hemp in 2018. So again, the facts were not all clear, but apparently some of his prior convictions had to deal with possessing and or maybe growing and or distributing hemp. And so when it
Hemp,
was
not marijuana.
decriminalized, yes. So
Hemp,
when it was decriminalized in
like the rope.
2018, um,
Not
the stuff that the rope is made of,
so he
yeah.
wasn't distributing the buds. He was distributing what?
Again, it was not entirely
A
clear from
weird.
the
Sorry,
facts.
that's fine. It's not. I'm just that's bizarre. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, kid.
So
Hey, psst, kid. You want to buy some high tensile rope that's biodegradable and safe for the environment? What? Yeah.
I'm sure there's some other facts behind this that
Weird.
make this pertinent, but there was some kind of decriminalization of hemp and or partial marijuana
Okay.
in 2018 in federal law. So what he's claiming is some of the convictions against him should not hold anymore because the law was updated in 2018, even though his convictions fell before 2018.
Okay.
So does that make sense? So
Yeah.
under current laws, some of his convictions should no longer apply
It makes
as
about as much sense as U.S. drug law can make. Yes.
right. But it poses an interesting question, I think. And as I continue, it'll sort of unravel even more. So the
That's a
third,
good pun.
as he appealed,
That's a good pun.
no pun intended.
Oh no, no,
Uh,
no, you should have taken it. I was like that. That's class right there.
as fair enough. As I said, he appealed this sentencing. So the Third Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against Mr. Brown, saying that the statute looks to what the law says at the time that the law was broken, not at the time of sentencing. So since his firearm offense occurred in 2016, and that was way before the change in marijuana laws in 2018, and all of his marijuana convictions were even before then ergo, all of those convictions should be applicable to the ACCA and qualify him for at least 15 years behind bars. Obviously, Brown appealed that decision again, and we are thus brought to the Supreme Court. So, the major argument here is Brown contends that at the time he was sentenced, with regards to the ACCA, any updates to the law should be taken into account, right? So any changes in marijuana law should be taken into account when sentencing is imposed. Since the ACCA makes a reference to the Controlled Substances Act, then normal standard legal practice says that any updated version of that Controlled Substance Act should be taken into account during sentencing and not an old version. So he was convicted of a law that has changed over the years. So he is fine with being convicted as he was back in the day. But as for currently applying those convictions to the ACCA and giving him a further sentencing, that's his problem, right? That's where he's saying any updates to the law should be taken into account in regards to his sentencing. So the United States, on the other hand, they contend that by inception, the purpose of the ACCA, which is true, is to stop recidivism, right? It's to stop recurring of the similar crimes. And
Sorry, how's that working out for them? Sorry, my snarky.
fair
Yeah,
enough, fair
how's that
enough.
working out? Yeah.
But that was the point, right?
No, I get it. Yeah, yeah.
They also say that because of this, the whole idea of the ACCA is to sort of look backward at previous crimes. So that should mean that the law should take into account what the law was when the conviction was made and not what it is during sentencing time. if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They also point to the fact that the U.S. kind of took umbrage to the fact that Brown, in his argument, is trying to pit state law against federal law by creating a loophole for those charged for violating state or federal law. Um, I thought that was an interesting part of their argument.
That's
So
good
basically,
strategy.
yeah, basically they're saying what Mr. Brown is trying to do is since he was since his convictions were under state law, and he's saying, but federal law changed, so I should be judged off of federal law and not state law. He's pitting the two against each
Yeah.
other, and that's not fair, right?
It's a great legal strategy.
It is,
Fairness
but
doesn't ex fair I, as always, you are more idealist and I'm more realist. I'm like, fairness doesn't exist in this system, but but you kind of gotta again, you can tell I've been rewatching The Wire. You gotta respect the game. You gotta respect the game.
in yes, I'll leave it at that. Yes, I will concede to that. I will respect his game.
Yeah, there you go.
Um, I will say that at the end of this, at the end of reading all of these, and I didn't go deep into the weeds because as I sort of alluded to at the beginning of the episode, this gets really, really nitty gritty into like details of old statutes and rewriting of statutes and all of that. And it's just too much. It's just way too much for anyone to care, honestly, except for the people involved. So
Yeah.
I left all of that out. Um, but even at the end, I don't find either of these arguments at all credible. I don't buy either one, either side. So I'm kind of like one of these people in the middle. I've read both arguments. I understand where they're both coming from, but I'm like, I don't think either of you are kind of right. So I don't know where to go with this. I feel for the justices in this scenario. I don't
I
know
think
what I would do in their shoes.
yeah. No, I think that's a very as always, you are more measured and that is a more measured response. My response is something like I find myself at an impasse for sort of a different reason.
Okay.
Knowing nothing about the case, just having heard it now. But that's why you bring me on, right? I'm like the
Yes.
man on the street, just like the, hey, I working class man. I don't know. Here's my not legal scholar. Here's my thing. Um, I can see I'm thinking about this more in terms of precedent. And
Hmm.
there's part of me that realizes now, obviously this is talking about drugs, but you can the legal philosophy, if you will, or philosophies at play here it probably will have ramifications. The
Yeah.
Supreme Court case. So I'm trying to think about it in terms of that. Obviously, I don't like criminals, and I don't want criminals on the street. So I have that. And obviously, something that puts criminals away, I tend to lean towards yay over nay. At the same time, the idea that you sentencing thing, sentencing people using older structures or statutes or whatever the term is, it makes sense, but it gives me kind of a weird feeling, like because whenever the government makes like whenever the Supreme Courts make a decision, I as a non-expert, but just as a person trying to live his life, I tend to think of how could this be used against me?
Right.
How could this possibly be misused? I'm not saying I'm not going to commit a crime. I'm saying how could this in this instance, it doesn't apply to me, fine. But how could this philosophy, if further, if carried out and expanded into other areas of law, how could that hurt me and or people I care about who are kind of, let's say, on our camp? I mean, doublethink media is ideologically I mean,
Yes.
we have a bent, right? It's like, and we are not in power, really. The right is not in power, and so I'm trying to like that's like, ooh, you're sentencing people, and I know that I'm taking this probably more conspiratorially, and I'm jumping maybe a couple
No.
too far, but I'm worried about this because it's like you're sentencing people based on laws that were changed. That's my thing. So laws can be changed for the better, they can be changed for the worse, or they could just be changed. But you're sentencing based on earlier legal structures. There's something that maybe it's just that sort of genetic English, Anglo-American common law thing of like, wait a second, that seems very bizarre to do because you're not even applying current laws, you're applying former laws. Then
Right.
why do we change laws? Like, why are laws changed at all then? You see what I'm saying? Like, it's a strange thing that gives me a not so great feeling.
So there's two things I want to say to this. First of all, you shouldn't apologize for taking it there because one of the main reasons that I started that I wanted to start a podcast like this, which I've sort of mentioned before, is for that particular reason. All of these cases theoretically have some bearing on our lives, and
Yeah.
as U.S. citizens, we should care about them. So by putting these episodes out there, the point is to get more people interested in the stuff that's going to impact your life in the legal system. So yeah, absolutely think of it in that way. Like, how is this going to affect me if they set some type of precedent? Now, that being said, I think what's at stake here, maybe not stake, I think the issue here, and again, I'm going to applaud Mr. Brown for his game, as you said earlier. He's using he's using the sloth pace of the judicial system in his favor. Because when he was convicted of those things back in the early 2000s, the law was a certain thing. Through the slow and painful legal process that we go through in this country, it's now been 10 plus years, and he's just starting to get certain sentencing based off of some of the crimes that he committed in the past. And so things naturally have changed. So he's using the fact that it's taken them so long to pass some type of real sentencing to his own advantage. And I gotta say, good for him.
I would
Do I
say
think do
I
I think
would
he deserves 30 years? No. Do I
no,
think he
that's
deserves like 10 maybe? Okay, fine.
right. I guess I want to reiterate, I'm not on the side of anybody who willfully injures other people or terrorizes communities,
Yes.
which is what drug dealers do.
Yes.
Regardless of your stance on legalization or any of these things or decriminalization, we can hash that out. I have opinion. It's not really not what that's a whole separate thing. But like the violence that engenders is real, and it really fucks over entire communities of people. So that I take. I mean, so I'm not like when I say respect the game. I mean, like, fine, you can respect the game. Doesn't make him a good person.
Right.
Doesn't mean I want him back on the street. Doesn't mean I want any of those things. Again, I'm really thinking about it more of like, okay, I don't even really care about him, right? Like, I care about how this, like I said, how this philosophy, interpretation, whatever you want to call it, there's probably some fancy legal term for that, could be applied to other cases. That's I'm like, huh. And
Yeah,
I will say
because
too, right?
theoretically,
It can work against law-abiding people too, right? Laws, maybe
yeah.
that were previous laws that were better, could be changed, and then now maybe people aren't getting sentencing at the level they should get. So I'm not saying there's not a double-edged sword quality to all this. I'm just saying that like, why do we? I guess it's kind of this like overly normie take of, well, why do we even have laws if the sentencing is not based on current laws?
And I should also point out that while this is very in a minute niche of the law, meaning this is answering a question about how we should sentence people who violate serious, quote, serious drug offenses, right? Or in violation of serious drug offenses. That doesn't mean that a precedent set by this case can be used in a case that is not about serious drug offenses, right?
Right,
People do
right,
that all the time. They take Supreme Court precedent and Supreme Court cases and say, well, they did this in this case, and while this is slightly not the same, we could extrapolate it out to also being used in our case here. So
right.
it does have ramifications
Yeah.
in the bigger picture.
And I will reiterate one more time, I do not want this individual back in public.
Yeah.
I don't even
Yeah.
know much about him, but based on what I've heard, no. You know, I have a little bit more. Singapore solution kind of mindset. But at the same time, right? I like I like as uniform or as let's say uniform is the wrong word as consistent application of legal philosophy as possible. That's sort of maybe that's just me being an autist, but I'm like, well, we have the laws for reasons, we have things for reasons, so why don't we follow? You know what I mean? Like that's sort of I guess where I'm coming from. It's like whoa,
Yeah.
um,
And
yeah,
worst case scenario, I think this case could really impact how the ACCA, the Armed Career Criminals Act, is implemented against armed career criminals who exactly like we don't want on the street.
I don't want, and that's the thing
Um,
too. Is it? But I also don't want, yeah, like I don't want armed career criminals on the street. So it's like that's it's yeah. So that's my impasse, I guess, is more of just of a like a how do we not fuck over American law-abiding Americans more? That's kind of my number one motivation. Is anyone who's listened to the show so far probably has grasped that. It's like I'm like outcomes. Like what kind of outcomes is this going to give us, right? And I don't know. I mean, but I'm not a legal scholar, and I don't know. But so anyhow, that's my normie take on this whole thing of like, oh gosh, but I feel conflicted.
which for those we'll end it here, but for those out there listening, this is the exact mindset that we don't want in a justice on the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
Because as a conservative, justices on the Supreme Court should be about um, originalism and textualism, right? What does the law actually say, and what were the people who wrote the law at the time? What did they mean for it to mean? That is a conservative legal philosophy.
yeah.
This purposivism is what they call it. This idea of how can I interpret this law based on what's going to come of it or what the outcomes are going to be. That's a very progressive way to read legal philosophy, and it's
We
while
should.
it makes sense and while it's uh, arguably, understandably, a way to do it, it's not the way that we should want our justices to do it, if that
You
makes
know,
sense.
I know that this is neither that we're at the end here, but you and I should actually hash this out sometime because I actually have a difference of opinion with you on this. But that's which would be interesting and fun to really get into the minutia. Oh, like that. Yes, but that well, maybe I'll just tease that as, or I'll put out that lure and see if you bite at some point. But yeah, because I actually have a sort of a different way of viewing it. But yeah,
All right.
no, I mean
Well,
that is a conservative. That's a conservative legal
yes.
recipe for sure. Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure how this one's going to turn out, but it has implications either way. So we will revisit this as soon as an opinion comes out. And until then, case dismissed.